All right. So again, starting with what I remember what you looked like as an HBA in our conversations back then. Okay.
Thinner,
So
glasses, no
right,
facial hair.
right. Yeah. So that's what I'm remembering is that guy. And then so you're thinking politics, you kind of decide not to go down that road. There are probably a host of reasons why, actually. That probably is a whole full set of things on its own. And then marketing and persuasion is the big
Mhm,
thing, right? This is what
mhm.
draws you, right? You're fascinated. Tell me if I've got any of this wrong, by the way, so far in
No,
this
you're
interview.
you're nailing it. Yeah.
Right. So you're fascinated by this. There are interesting things about this because the Ivy institution might have been nudging you in other directions, but you've got this thing that you've just kind of latched onto, right? And so
Mhm.
so and nothing wrong with that. That's good. You already had clear signals, right? About there's something really interesting about this and it draws you. So then you start going in this direction, and then you wanted to be the Facebook ads guy, and you end up being sort of like the direct mail guy, which is way less
Yeah.
sexy and
Yeah.
sort of confusing. And we could probably have a side conversation about whether there's something business specific to that or Canada specific, because I have heard that before that in
Mhm.
Canada direct mail actually has a higher effectiveness rate than it does in the US. I don't know if that statement is true, but I've heard it.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, yeah, and of course there's questions about like why that would be, but this is not really a direct mail podcast or story.
Sure.
So we sort of move on from that, and then where it gets interesting, I think, right? And it was interesting before that, where it sort of reaches at least a short-term climax in the story, is you've got a toxic colleague that
Mhm.
you're dealing with. Now, just what, this is the sensitive part where I have to sort of ask you questions about it without necessarily kind of putting pressure on you to reveal too much. Was this a
So,
colleague at the same level as you? Was it a boss? Like, how would you describe the
so,
relationship?
so I would say that's probably what fueled a chunk of it because it was actually kind of unclear. And was she superior? Was she a peer? And I think thinking that I had to defer to this person was really part of what unfortunately made it harder to stand up to them. So I think not having those clear boundaries of how can I give feedback, because a if it was a boss, myself at the time would have been extremely deferential. If it was a colleague, myself at the time was still extremely deferential. It sucks, but I think often about like, man, I don't wish a lot of people ill. Like I've moved somewhat, not full, somewhat beyond that. But man, oh man, I hope every time they put on socks, they step in a puddle immediately. I wish bad things for this person.
Oh, interesting. Um, are you comfortable, at least at a high level, describing what exactly was the problem? Was it just person? When you say toxic, toxic means a lot of things, by the way, right?
Sure,
People use
sure,
this
sure.
word in very different context, and so it's sort of the catch-all phrase. Um, was it a lack of competence? Was it horrible communication? Was it personality disorder kind of stuff? Was it
Yeah,
bullying? Like, how would you describe the issue?
I, I would describe it as like extreme passive aggressiveness mixed with like not incompetence, but thinking they were far more competent than they were. Like they weren't bad, but they thought they were like unreal. And then I would like cross that with a mix of like a like a significant lack of boundaries. Um it was a startup and I came into it knowing that hey, we're going to be working like I would like 9 till 6:50 every day was my schedule. So I'm like, cool, we're already doing that. And my day would go from like quarter to 6 because I'd wake up, commute in from Mississauga, and then like I'd commute 3 hours round trip. Like a terrible. It built character, and I'm super happy I never will ever have to do that again. Um, but yeah, it'd be like 5:45 to like 8:30. On good days, I'd get home at 8:30. On most days, I'd get home at 8:45. Eat dinner, pass out, repeat for a year. And sometimes I'd be on the phone with this person, like they would call me, and I'm like, well, I don't know how to not pick up this call. So I'm like, okay, I guess. And then that would eat further into like decompression time slash live extremely limited living time. If you could call that living, and I maybe wouldn't. Um, so I would say that it's kind of those factors that contributed to like what was what was once like, okay, yes, we work really, really hard, but we're all in this together, and at least I like these people. To I like everyone here except this person, and that makes this what was like functional burnout into like this sucks, and this is now becoming like not functional burnout, which is seems redundant to say, but how functional is burnout? But yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So, and then I'm assuming you did all the sort of things that one would do in that situation. You would sort of try to talk about it. You would try to kind of bring this up as an issue, and it just none of these things would
No,
work.
that's the worst part, Brian. No solutions, no solutions were attempted, and that's why I think it hurts because, or it still hurts a little bit as like a, an injury from a decade ago would, because it's like, um, wow, I didn't have the skills to deal. Like my skills were, hey, let's win them over with like who do I have in my life who I haven't won over, right? Like no one, because it's a self, it filters out. Um, but it's like, wow, none of those skills of like likability and stuff are working with this person. I don't know how to tell you to, I don't know if we can swear on this podcast, but like, I don't know how I can.
It's for adults, so I suppose in principle you
Sure.
can.
Like, how do you professionally tell someone to fuck off? And I was like, boy, I would love that. And you know, I didn't have that ability at the time. So um if I could redo it, I would be like, okay, we have a problem here. We need to like, and some other colleagues who are much better at setting boundaries even still had quite a few issues with this person. So outside of so, it's not to say that like, I don't want to attribute too much the blame to, 20, I don't know how old I was, but like, yeah, 20, 25, 26-year-old Jeremy, like, yeah, this was a bad person. So how do you find the skills to deal with someone toxic, someone who probably has who's I don't know what the kosher way is, but who's maybe has their own stuff to deal with would be maybe the most empathetic way of classing it. It's like, yeah, business school doesn't train for that. Business school is like, I would say 30% those people, if not a lot more. So it's like, I would actually say probably a lot more.
More than 30, I would agree. I mean, having taught, I mean, I love all
Yeah.
my students, but if I had to classify personalities and likelihood of causing trouble, right,
Yeah,
in some
yeah.
way, shape, or form, yeah, and one of the lessons I think, I certainly learned it when I was going through it in my 20s because I didn't know it when I was in school, and it sounds like that you've gone through is organizations are actually exceptionally poorly designed to deal with this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It's exception. So really great leadership. One trait of really great leaders and great leadership is that they actually can deal with these things and do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we haven't talked about leadership at all yet, right? But my observation is there's an extraordinarily small number of people I would call great leaders, right? And who, as a percentage of the people who have a job title that I would say has leadership in it.
Is a leadership. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I would agree
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. And so when that's the world, and you get thrown in at 22 or 25 and you
Yeah.
run into your first whatever, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, you learn that actually the system really isn't. It's not like, when you're an HBA student, like if your grading goes wrong, like you really can go to the prof and actually make a
Sure.
case. And there's
Yeah.
actually an appeal committee that will review that if you wanted to.
There's yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%.
And people will actually listen to you, but if you work in an organization, it's actually remarkable how little there is, ironically, to
Yeah.
help you in situations like that. So yeah, we could have a whole separate podcast just about kind of stories about that. And many people go through this and they don't talk about this, right? Which is why we all pretend that businesses don't have these problems. But
Oh yeah. And I mean, I do still think like I think being like grateful for it is giving it way too much credit, but at least it gave me the standard of what like it's great to have standards of what good looks like. This is the polar opposite. And it's not a horrible thing if we're looking for silver linings to have an idea of what like, oh, this is bad, this is red flags. Like figure out a way out of this or make a better case for yourself because this is not okay. So having an example of that is or was good. I will say that we probably could have taken like 40 or 50% off of it because it's like, cool, the worst person not like literally the worst person you've ever met. It's like, cool, maybe I didn't need to meet the worst person I've ever met to learn what boundaries are. Like, I could have
yeah,
learned that lesson
too bad you
in
didn't
a
get to
jump.
choose, I guess, would be the other way
Yeah,
to say it, right? Not exactly your choice if this would have
not my
gone this way.
choice. Yeah.
Yeah, as is the case in many of our instances. Uh, on this note, this actually reminds me of the story I'm going to tell you is true. I can't tell you which company it is because they don't publicly disclose it. It's a big company that you have absolutely heard of. So folks in their HR department actually somehow were able to tie the prescription medication that people were taking for things like depression and anxiety, uh, and were able to identify individuals in the firm that were very likely the cause of taking these medications. Now, what I'm saying is extremely kind of like, so this is why it's not publicly disclosed, right? Of course, like this is posting on a podcast later. If someone asks,
Yeah.
"Hey, Brian, who was it?" I'll be like, "I don't know what you're talking about." I will deny this and say that this was just my brain malfunctioning at this point.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, they could actually pin it down to managers in particular
Sure.
that were
100%.
exceptionally toxic is the right word, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's a
Yeah.
pretty definitive measure of damage you're causing, right?
Yeah.
To the psyche of people in an organization. And of course, truthfully, right? The only difference between what this company was doing and every other company is they could actually track it. Every other company just isn't really aware of the scope of it, but of course it's happening elsewhere, right? So
And in fairness to those other companies, that sounds like a HIPAA violation. Like that sounds I mean, working in sales, you learn, wow, a lot of things are okay with information in the US that are super not okay in other parts of the world. But yeah, that's fascinating. And the word you use, you said toxic was the right word. Damage is also the right word, I would say. Um, yeah, that's wild. I have 1,000 questions, but yeah, that's
yeah, so I'll actually give you the only other piece of information I know about this story. And again, from a very credible source, absolutely
sure.
believe it's true. Um, in the end, there was a question of what can we do about this?
Mhm.
And the answer was actually nothing, right? Because the moment they brought in or asked a lawyer, for example,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because, the lawyer is like,
Yes.
well, we can't prove that it's just a correlation, right?
Yeah.
Now, the hilarious thing is, as an academic, like as a researcher, like this would
It's
actually
all
be
yeah.
this would be pretty close to publishable somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah. Yeah.
mean, like people wouldn't be like, I don't know about it, depending on how good the data is and how sharp it is. If
Yeah.
you see that the 5 people who work for this manager are all taking this medication, and they didn't take it before, and then they
Yeah.
stop taking it when they're not working for that. I mean, how many more things do you really need before you start
Yeah.
saying, well, maybe it is that guy, right? Or I
Yeah.
don't know if it's a guy, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But because they didn't feel like they could prove it, that created legal liability, and so therefore the default was, well, nah, right? Nothing.
Classic. Yeah.
Yeah. Which
And
again, yeah.
fair. But yeah, like, as a layman, I'm like, wow, that's interesting and 1,000 red flags at the same time. Like there's some good there, and there's a lot of like, yeah, it sounds like you'd be credibly sued.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating.
Yeah. And also speaks to sort of kind of the tragedy of the dysfunction of organizations, right? I mean, the Dilbert cartoonist isn't wrong, right? When he sort of portrays organizations as these sort of absurd kind of entities sometimes, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. What logically is true, or what seems true to outside observers, is like deeply untrue, or there's a bunch of made up rules. I say this all the time to like new hires who I talk to. I'm like, listen, and I say it in the context of like jargon or processes. Like Plato didn't write about sales rules of engagement. All of this stuff is made up. Nobody is born knowing this stuff. Like industry jargon, acronyms, whatever, whatever, whatever. So I'm like, listen, if you have any what you might perceive or think to be like a dumb question, please ask me, because I can't promise you I'll have an answer, but I will help you try and find it. Like we can find it together, because like none of this stuff is intuitive. Organizations are absurd creatures. They're the good, some of them might come with a manual on how to navigate them. The manual is probably like 2 years out of date. So I'm just trying to think back to like the Bridgestone case, or Bridgewater.
Bridgewater.
Is,
Bridgestone would
yeah,
be a tire
some,
company, which I never touch.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Bridgewater, I'd be curious for your opinion, like and I wonder how these absurdities would play out in an organization like that, where now, okay, let's give grace on the idea of like brutal honesty. You're not being an asshole. Like, let's assume that they do a good enough job at filtering for like goodness or integrity or whatever, that it's like people aren't just using honesty to do damage to people. How would an organization that, I'm not going to call maybe any company enlightened, but a company that does it differently, how do they handle toxicity? Like, is the bar for toxicity there higher because it's like, well, that's just honesty?
that is a great question. I actually don't know the answer. I'm going to be honest with you. When I taught you guys Bridgewater, I still teach Bridgewater. Um, as far as we get, right? So Bridgewater, by the way, is a very polarizing case, depending on which group of students. Even when I teach it to executives, like half the room just hates it because it triggers everything inside them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of like this is the definition of toxic, right? Because
Sure.
they've worked in places where the values are quite different. Um, and then there's of course another group that actually likes the honesty and is critical of the
Yeah.
organizations that they think are too nice to actually function well.
Yeah.
And that's part of the teach, right? The transparency, like, are we honest with each other? So the whole kind of point of that teach is to get people aware enough that where they are,
Mhm.
actually honesty is not actually a norm as much as they think it is. Because the beginning is always like, oh, of course, we're like totally honest with each other. And the moment like there's a couple more follow-up questions, they're like, well, oh no, we don't do that. Right. And so, it's just like, okay, so guys, just connecting the dots here, right? And then comparing to Bridgewater and they don't have to like Bridgewater, they just have to see that Bridgewater is designed in such ways to address a lot of the failures that we think of as normal, right?
Mhm.
The reason why I'm summarizing this is like we never get to the point of what would toxicity in Bridgewater look like? That's like next level, right?
Mhm.
And I have never had a class move far enough in sort of up the curve on the case to even ask that question. So,
Well, it took me like 10 years, so don't fault them. Yeah.
and okay, you 10 years, my students so far, right? Unless I listen to this podcast, never. question has never come up, right? And to be candid, it's not like in the teaching note for the case or my read of it that it says, like, here's how we handle toxicity. Like the framing is, it's obviously very positive that we address all of these problems in organizations. Of course, what happens, right, intuitively is that rather than creating perfection, that creates a potential for other perverse outcomes, right? This is generally always the problem with governance, right? Whether it's political governance of a state, right, or a province or a nation or whatever, or an organization or these things. Like anytime you're trying to solve something, you essentially are stuck with imperfect solutions or a menu of imperfect solutions, and you essentially pick your poison and then you just do the best you can, right? And so while we started this podcast kind of discussing like, oh gosh, organizations are so absurd, part of the reason is, right, and not to let organizations really completely off the hook, because I think there's way too much laziness still in the way they're managed. But it's still true that even best case, you wouldn't get perfection, right? Like not with humans, at least. Maybe with a bunch of robots and an AI managing everything, right? But not with humans. And so yeah, I mean, in principle, one could imagine a really complicated form of toxicity that might be showing up at Bridgewater, right? I think an interesting question is whether they would agree that that's the case, because Bridgewater is, to an outsider, to some degree, a little bit cult-like, right, in some sense. And I mean, if we know anything about cults, right, if that analogy is actually correct, it'd be really hard to actually see that toxicity, right? Because you've bought into the values and the messaging and all this stuff so much. It's a little bit tough, right? Now, this is the point where maybe it isn't cult-like, right? It's just to the outside observer, it's just the best word we can come up with, but actually it's not really accurate because cults don't actually like it when you question things, right? And challenge and give feedback. So in some sense, actually, in principle, it shouldn't be cult-like at all. It's like the anti-cult, right? But to our sort of untrained eyes, it's like when you see an alien, you're like, well, what does it look like? And you're like, I don't know, like a cross between a giraffe and an elephant, like, but it's not, right? It's like maybe something different. So maybe that's what Bridgewater actually is. But super, super interesting question. And I got to admit, as a prof, despite having taught this case for years, many years now, we've never made it to the point where even that even comes up for discussion. And I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and I think the further complicating factor is because of the nature of their work, like the thing that comes up in startups often is like the brilliant asshole. It's like, yeah, he sucks, but we need him to get further. And at Bridgewater, it's like, well, if somebody's terrible, but they're delivering 200% returns, can we not, like, because what happens if we cut them? One, we're gonna have to pay out, like, I don't know what severance in the industry looks like, but it's 7 figures, 8 figures, I don't know. Then he's gonna go work for some competition. They'll be able to tout that they have like Bridgewater's hot shot, like too hot for Bridgewater or something. And then we have some reputational damage to manage. So it's like, can we not knowing anything, I would imagine that they would try to probably isolate that person in a sense where it's like, cool, you don't have to deal with like these peons. You can just crush it. But then how does that affect the whole Bridgewater thing of like honesty? Because can they honestly tell someone who's, maybe got stuff to deal with, like, hey, the honest feedback about you is that you're not good at the maybe leadership piece. We'll keep you around. Somebody like that who might be, this word's thrown around a lot, but in the example that I'm imagining, it's true. Someone who's like a narcissist, like, how would they react to that feedback? Not well. So is it even given in the first place if they're crushing it? So it's a unique organization, but maybe I think that's a very typical case of what could arise.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I mean, even though in every strategy class, like I'll spend a segment of every class talking about how culture and people management essentially can create competitive advantage, what is true is that that is not true for the vast majority of firms that exist in the world, right? In other words, that is not how they do it, right? And
Yeah.
even if they could, they just don't, right? And one question is why. And if you dig into the few examples I'm able to find in the world to show, they're hard, right? Like
Yeah.
you really need leadership who's deeply committed, whose values align. These are typically founder-led organizations even, so then they almost sound like philosophers. So you need that sort of belief. And we live in a world where you can still have a very successful company in principle and not care about any of those things that much, right? And
Yeah.
so a lot of people would just tend to pick the other road because it requires a lot of it starts really touching things like personal development, growth, culture, ethics, integrity, right? All these things that are very popular in certain circles. But then what always cracks me up is somehow they never really want to admit or reconcile their views with like the 48 Laws of Power, if you've ever heard that book.
Yeah.
Right. And we all know that there are plenty of organizations that, the 48 Laws of Power are going to do a much better job of explaining and helping you to get through. Right. And so yeah, there is this kind of issue, I think, that comes up. What I will say, so one of the guest speakers I have every year that come by is a guy who is the CEO and founded one of the most successful, I'll just broadly say real estate companies in the United States. Sure. And the talk that he gives is entirely about people. Like it's not about, the five forces or the brilliant moves they made or any of that stuff. And so I know, yeah, I see you cringing right here. We won't talk about that anyway. That's not the purpose of this. But what he really believes, and he actually walks the walk, right? And he is that basically what they think a huge part of their competitive advantage is relative to everyone else in that real estate business is that they get maybe what he'll say another 5 to 10% of the effort that people are willing to kind of give because they work in a place that they like and are willing to kind of give to that, right? I mean, they do have high expectations, but at the same time, they're also very committed to kind of appreciating like a set of values that I think a lot of people would find appealing. And so he thinks that drives like a lot of their competitive advantage. And he tells a story where, earlier in the growing phase of their business, right, they actually had someone who was extremely good at what they did, but was a real, I'll say, very difficult person, but you had a better word for it. And they had to decide like this person was like, everyone was having trouble, right? Like it was just abundantly clear the personality of this individual was creating damage, right? Let's go back to that in the organization. But this guy was bringing in a lot of money, right? And so they really had this was one of those defining moments for their organization of like, okay, so do we really stick to our principles that we said that we were going to be into, or do we give this guy a pass, right?
Yeah.
And this was a hard decision at the time. They were still kind of in the growth phase. Like, I mean, it was and the guy actually ended up going to a competitor and making their lives harder, ironically.
Yeah. 100%.
But they let him go. That was the call. And what he'll say is every time we've had kind of one of these moments of like, what do we do? Like, they have a set of principles that just guides them, that they just go with, right? Instead of sitting down or running it in the spreadsheet. And it's really values driven. It's culture driven. Okay. Now, to keep in mind, like what they're doing, part of why they're so good is because culture is part of their competitive advantage, right? Like people trust each other more, they like each other more. There's a lot of long-term effects in an industry where I have never heard of other real estate organizations doing nearly as good a job of this, right?
Yeah.
They don't win HR management awards, right? Like this is an industry that is
I
just
wouldn't
not
necessarily go for that as the barometer of success.
You're right. That was actually the wrong phrasing. Yeah, those awards do not mean what we think they mean. So yes, correct. But you get what I'm saying. So do our listeners. So those things can matter, but truthfully, I mean, this is a guy who shows up on only one of my days as a guest speaker, and on the other days I get other, they're good people, like they're great speakers, but they're not usually talking about people, right? They're talking about
Mm,
something else. And so
sure.
and I think that's far more an accurate description of the world that we tend to live in, right? It's not that all individuals are bad, but it's more that organizations don't do a good job of, shall we say, kind of dealing with this behavior, right? And sometimes
Sure.
rewards this behavior, which is why we see, very successful individuals sometimes
Mhm.
not having the characteristics or values we would sometimes like them to, right? So, yeah,
100%.
this is something I wish we had actually taught to you guys in business school. I don't know who would exactly, but
So actually, I might. So the closest thing that Ivy had to an ethics class was a class that Janice Seitz taught and still teaches, which is giving voice to values. It might have a different name now. I think it's giving voice to leaders now. But it's the idea of it's not teaching you ethics. It's helping you identify your values and giving you an understanding of like if your values are confronted and you have to make a choice, here's how you can go about making that case with an understanding of the consequences of speaking up. Because it's not like happily ever after. There can be real consequences and damages, both personal and of course professional, that come with that. So it's like, and it's not telling you, I've talked to that class a bunch about. I had an ethical conundrum I dealt with, and it was like, she told me in advance, hey, some of the students here are, one of them is like just all about the money you can make, and that's all he cares about. I'm like, cool. So I said, hey, look, by the way, if you're a mercenary, which is, I've done that for short-term consulting contracts, that's fun. It's fun to perceive yourself that way occasionally. But I'm like, listen, man, if you're actually going to sell out, whatever you're charging, add tax and interest, because like you have to sleep with these decisions. And that's something that I could never, I mean, I don't believe I could ever do. Um, so I think that would be the forum in which of like, because it's not just speaking out about like, hey, they're dumping whatever in the river. It's like, hey, how do we speak up about a toxic colleague? I think it would be some mix of like values plus strategy plus comms into like, okay, how do we protect ourselves in these environments?
yeah, here's the challenge that I see with that though. Maybe Jana, I mean, she's not on this podcast episode, obviously. Maybe she has a response for this, but I think here's the really hard thing. If you come out, Jeremy, when you graduated, you come into an organization, let's say you run into not just a toxic individual, but a toxic place, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then you come out with the lesson of, okay, it's time for me to speak my values, right? If your values truly don't align with that place, and that becomes abundantly clear, you're essentially not a good fit for that organization. You're going to get canned. Now, here's the irony. That place you're going to get canned from isn't going to have the reputation publicly of being a toxic place necessarily, right? It will for everyone who's been there and for people who deal with them and all that.
Yeah.
But kind of in the broader business context, like it'll be a known firm in many instances, right? If particularly if you're a business undergrad. And so there's a particular challenge then, right? That you have of, well, then you look bad, right? For leaving a
Yeah, for
place.
sure. Yeah.
So I'm just imagining like how this would play out. Now, I never, frankly, at the time, when I was in my 20s, I never had the courage or maybe even the awareness to kind of think about this issue, or maybe I just didn't run into it deeply enough. But if somebody decides to leave a job or gets let go at age 22 or 23 from a place that people have heard of,
Mhm.
and in the next interview they're saying, "Okay, tell me what happened here," and you tell them honestly, "Look, this place was extremely toxic.
Oh,
My values
not
are
the way.
X, Y, Z." Yeah, this other person, what are they hearing? What they're probably hearing is, "Oh, like you can't handle
Sure.
organizations." Right? Even if it was actually a horrible, toxic place,
Yeah.
right? The bias goes against the individual in that case, and I think that makes this
Yeah,
really difficult, right?
100%. I would say that's part of the communication because like you don't have to living your values doesn't mean this is funny. Living your values doesn't mean like talking about them in an interview. Living your values is like having the guts to leave, not the guts, maybe that's being uncharitable. Have like leaving that organization, whether you get fired or whether you choose to leave, leaving is the right, like if you're a freaking under, like an entry level, whatever, consulting intern, and it turns out the whole thing is rotten, get out of there. You're not, it's not on your shoulders. I mean, this isn't like some, I don't think there are any anime based on consulting, but this isn't some consulting anime where it's like you are the special one. You're probably, I mean, probably not. Like if you were that brilliant, you wouldn't be an entry level consultant. You'd be doing something else. Like you should leave immediately, and you should be thankful that however long you lasted there is only as long as you stayed there, because there are other people who, I know someone who's lovely and smart and brilliant and feels like they can't leave this toxic place that they've spent like 8 years at out of a fear of retribution. And I'm like, dude, just quit. Like, probably you're not like, hurting for cash. Just quit. It's fine. You can probably be fine with other things. And they just won't. And it hurts me. But I'm like, I can't do anything to save this person. So yeah, if you're trying to live your values there, what I learned, 22-year-old who got fired for not fitting the values of a toxic organization,
Sure.
good. Like that's the best thing that could have happened to you. And the fact that it happened early, great. Like I do have friends, a specific friend who has worked at a toxic company for like 8 years, and I can't understand why she stays there because she's great. She's desperately trying to find something else, but she's so scared of like retribution or something that she just can't leave. And it's like we can't save that person. And you as a 22-year-old undergrad are not going to change a culture of toxicity at an organization that's probably pretty long in the tooth. The best thing you can do if you're trying to live your values is protect them, protect yourself, and get out of there. In terms of how that reflects on like your next resume, frankly, like if you only spent a year there or less, like if you spent 6 months there, maybe just leave it off. Maybe you can tell a story of like if you go into that interview, and I know this and I speak this actually from experience. If you go in an interview and you were like, hey, I was asked to do something against my values and I didn't, and that led to me not getting the role, that's not going, like you could be 100% in the right. That's probably not going to get you a new job. There's a way to tell that story where you can focus on the good. Like if you choose to leave it on the resume, focus on the good that you did. And then you can tell a story about, ultimately the role was evolving into something that it's not the direction I wanted to take my career. Or ultimately the role was evolving in a way that, da 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 da. And there's a few ways that this goes. Option A is they take you at your word. Option B is if you're talking to someone in leadership, they can actually read between the lines. And so there's a way of saying it that's very professional, that actually demonstrates quite a bit of savvy, that is also not, it was against my values. It was against my values is like too, noble, I'll say. It casts you in too good of a, but if you say, look, the organization was going in a direction that I like wasn't comfortable with, but you couch that in a look at all my achievements, even despite that, that's probably enough for most people to be like, got it. Everyone's been there. Everyone probably has a story like that. You know how to tell yours in a way that's fine. Like you actually have some savviness to it. Cool. Let's move on with the rest of
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that actually went through my head as you were describing this is that I'm not aware of any organization that actually, unless they're doing it through a personality test, actually are asking about values in terms of the one-on-one meetings, right?
Yeah,
Which actually you would think would be a really important question actually to ask.
I think we're in a post. I keep coining terms that I would hate if I like read them by someone else. Like I was about to say, we're in like a post values world. Ugh, that's disgusting. We're not. But I think when I was at school, the conversations about like values or like HR awards, like I used top 100 places to work as a barometer of like, oh, that must mean it's a great place to work. Absolutely not. Brian's not saying this. I am. I think most of these awards are like bought and paid for. All these people know each other. And it's like, do you want to make the list? Yes. Oh, by the way, could you give us some money? Sure. Great. We're good. Like, don't use awards don't matter. Like values, I think, I go back to what one time the dean of the program gave us as students feedback. It's like, if anything, Ivy students are too slick and too trained. And it's like hard. They don't actually, we can't, which being in that culture at the time, I'm like, oh, slickness is great. Like that's great. No, that's terrible. You can't trust someone who's slick. You're cool. I'll have a drink with you, but like I can't trust you. That's way like if you're slick, you can't be trusted. Um, and so asking what are your values in an interview, I think it's a bullshit question that people know how to answer with bullshit, and it gets us nowhere and it wastes like 4 minutes of our time. So let's just like cut it. We'll try and extrapolate your values through other means, and then we'll see where we land.
Ah, okay. So I'm with you. I get that the asking of the values as a direct question, probably not the best way to go for all kinds of reasons, right? That gets gamed.
Yeah.
Do you think organizations ask for it indirectly then? Because that's exactly what you're proposing, right?
Yeah. I think I still don't think a lot of them do.
I agree.
I think that that would be the much better way forward. Like, and that's probably supported in like how they do psychological surveys, right? They'll throw 100 questions at you, and it'll actually be like whatever 35 questions, but asked in different permutations, and we'll see how you actually like land on the board. Organizations don't do stuff like that unless if you're doing like 5 rounds of interviews, they might be able to in some capacity. It's still really, I think what they probably have to do is like zero in on these are the 3 questions that we know, or we have a really good feeling chart the success or fail of a new hire. Let's find like 5 different ways to ask them, and then let's try that and see where we land. That's, I think, outside of I would say that that's maybe the best way to approach it from, again, someone who knows nothing about how to go about this. I would say that makes sense. And then you'd also, even then, you'd still need that level of deference from candidates. Like, are people, depends on how the market is, are people willing to go through like 5 or 7 rounds of interviews? If you're a FANG, probably. If you're like OpenAI, definitely, or Anthropic or whatever. But if you're some cool Series B startup, like, is that how we want to run our organization? Or do we want to move on like bias to action and like just see where we land, hire slow, fire fast kind of deal?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, there's a whole another class of organizations that you actually didn't mention there, which is many of the employers that
The
hire from
rest
Ivy.
of the
Yeah,
companies.
like that would be the vast majority of the employers actually that Ivy
Yeah.
students go to. But yeah, yeah, there's also them too that might be different. Um, okay, so Jeremy, this has been interesting so far. So toxic colleague situation. You were 25 when you kind of ran into this. Um, weren't ready for it because why would you be, right? I
Yeah.
mean that so it sort of naturally ends up being an issue. Um, and of course creates this cost, right? That shows up. Just out of curiosity, I have actually never asked this question to any of my former students before. You were not the only guy to ever have this experience who's graduated. Like this we know.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you have any sense for how many of your classmates, like if we had to put a percentage of every graduating class, like how many of them will run into this in their first 5 years, for example? And I know we're just making up numbers here, but I have no idea.
Now, I would say it would depend on what like it would depend on the intensity of it. Because this is truly the worst person I've ever met. Now, I don't think everyone in their first 5 years working at a school will meet the worst person they've ever met. Because boy, would that say something about like if the majority of people are graduating to Toronto, like boy, we have a we have a real problem in society. Or it's like to your point earlier on the survey, it's like, wow, are we all meeting like the same person? That's crazy, dude. Uh, so I'll give you, I would say a majority, not a significant. Like I would say probably somewhere in like the low 50s are having an experience with somebody who's toxic from a if there's like a scale of toxicity, which is a wrong metric because there's a scale of toxicity and then there's your resilience to it, which will depend situationally how much you're getting paid. Like or amongst other values. Like, it's not just I have investment banking in my head. But like if you get to do incredible, like life-changing, life-affirming work, which would suck way more if you're in that scenario and you have to deal with toxic people, because the contrast there is just that would throw me into a tailspin. But I would give you like 50, low 50s, I would say.
Sorry, just so I understand, you don't mean the count, you mean low 50%? Is that what you...
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so okay. I
Yeah.
mean, so we finished off at basically one out of every two, right? Essentially,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah, I would say so.
that is that's a very high number, right? There's no other way to say it.
Yeah. I, I
Yeah.
I don't think it's so. I'll start from the position, and Brian's not saying this, I'm saying it. Ivy, and maybe this is true of all business schools. I don't know. I've been to just the one. The most toxic environment. Um, Let me know if I need to like not go on this rant right now. We can
Um,
cut that.
Look, actually, it's fine with me. I don't work there
Yeah.
anymore, right? So it helps that there's no consequence on me for this. Um, you're not the first student or former student to mention this to me
Yeah.
as a description of the culture there. I think for the people listening, because this is not something that's openly talked about. Like even when I heard it from students, it's always quietly, like in my office with the door closed, kind of thing. But for the people listening, to the extent you're comfortable describing what you mean, even at a high level, what do you mean when you say this, Jeremy?
Oh, absolutely. I'll yeah. And let me start from a place of so a business school that is seen as in Canada the best business school. And this was everything I'm saying is stuff that was true like 10 years ago. It's probably still true in the marketing, whether it was ever objectively true. It's like the most expensive to my knowledge, which um, you know, says what it says. So Ivy, the school for like investment bankers, the school for consultants, the only school that Goldman Sachs would fly to like London, Ontario for. London's actually great. I don't know. I don't begrudge London. But yeah, New York to London, Ontario is not a flight path, right? So they're coming to see these grants. BCG, Bain, McKinsey, they're coming here. So that's an environment that creates like, cool, you're elite. Like there's no other way to put it. You guys are elite. This is also a school that has, it's not like, I don't want to say it's like old money, because it's Canada. But there's legacies at Ivy. There's real for Canada. There's real wealth there. Um, and so that creates a culture of some level of, I wouldn't even say some level of, I would say it's like objectively, we're better. And that's not even like Western somehow has two business schools. And it is consistently, we're better than you, that other business school, but also everyone else. And so that's the environment that fresh-faced HBAs your third year student are walking into. HBA's honors Bachelor of Arts. I would bet you a substantial number of Ivy people think it stands for like Honors Business Administration. It would be really funny if I was wrong with that, because I'm coming from a place of hella superiority here. So it would be very funny if my self-righteousness was misguided in that way. So you're coming into an environment of like, at face value, it's orientation week, hard partying. Your first week anywhere, why would that be intense? And Ivy throws you right into the thick of it, which I'm aggressively not a big fan of. I think you're not setting people up for success by just like throwing them into the deep end. But anyways, that's more personal feedback than the toxicity piece. I had the worst year of my life was HBA. I was in the darkest place. The toxicity piece is, if people drop out from Ivy or withdraw from Ivy, they're openly because you couldn't make it. We're all suffering. We're all sleep deprived. We're all surrounded by the highest achieving group of people we've ever been a part of, and nobody wants to look weak. So we talked about incentives before. Well, nobody wants to look weak. Nobody wants to look like they can't cut it. That's why, Brian, these discussions are almost always behind closed doors. Because if you admit that you're suffering, like, or you're not doing well, there are going to be like good people who will want to try to help. But there's also people who are like, I'm only succeeding here because I can bury these feelings down and not reflect on, I just paid, or if I'm not from old money, my parents who are very working class have just paid the most amount of money, or loans. Like, I've taken on the most, maybe I was doing okay beforehand or maybe not, but I've just taken on an exponentially larger amount of debt to come into this environment where everyone talks about we're the best, we're the brightest. You should be able to keep up. No one's having trouble. We talked about cults. This is a fucking cult, dude. Like, sunk cost fallacy plus like alpha blinders. Nobody's asking for help. Honesty is punished. You goddamn right it is. Like, when have you, I'll tell you, like, when have you ever heard anyone publicly give honest feedback to Ivy? Like, at the school, when people, unfortunately is far too sanitized a word, but like, when things get real and things get very, very real, the school has this idea of like, they can throw up their hand. We had no idea. Well, yeah, dude, you dramatically disincentivize honest feedback. You uphold toxicity in the sense of whoever couldn't make it wasn't strong enough to make it. Well, there are some folks who, in a very literal sense, didn't make it. And if you call them weak, we're going to take this outside. Like, so that's when I say, like, toxicity. This is the most toxic place that I've ever been a part of. And for what it's worth, I tried to change it. I tried going to the dean of the program privately the day before, and not to give myself too much credit, I did this the day before I graduated, just in case there was any kind of retribution. I laid it barer than I'm laying it now. I told my own story. I frame it as like a kamikaze run against like the wall. Because this is, hey, Ivy students are slick. Rather, the profs, present company excluded. But the profs are, and I say that, the profs are some of the slickest people. The ones who are like the dyed-in-the-wool folks who are like in positions of leadership. You're not going to crack them. This was my like attempt. Like, can we actually break the facade and get like can I actually ask you about your values and get like an honest answer in an interview, but like with actual stakes to it? So I tried that. There were visiting deans who asked for honest feedback. I tried with them and nothing changed. So I'm like, what do we do in toxic environments? We leave. I don't have really any intention of going back. So I don't care.
And I think for, okay, wow, there's like multiple thoughts going through my head right now.
Sure.
Um, One thing that I do just want to say out loud for anyone who's listening, Jeremy, when the guy I remember when you were in my elective class, right? So this was just before you were graduating.
Mhm.
Maybe you had these feelings, but you weren't going around, I don't think, espousing them very strong. Like you didn't say this
No.
to me, right? Like I'll be honest and say that I'm surprised by the intensity of how you feel. Not to take anything away from the legitimacy of it, but I'm surprised only because
Sure.
you didn't say that to me uh,
I had said it
back
to
then.
enough people that I was like, okay, like this isn't, part of it is you learn to paddle. You're not that you should, but you learn of like, okay, how many more profs do I need to talk to about this before I need to talk to like a professional? So, and I think by third year, I was in a place where I wasn't post caring. I was part of like my HBA, which was their paltry like mental health initiative. I wrote a bunch of blogs for it. I was like maybe in a better spot. Maybe HBA, I had HBA one was the worst. HBA two and three, but
Okay.
continue.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. Like everything that you're describing, I'll be candid. I
Mhm.
don't remember hearing much about it in the faculty meetings when we would get together and talk about this stuff. So,
Wonder why.
so it wasn't like these were openly being discussed and then it was like, hey guys, at least in the meetings, it wasn't like people were saying, hey, let's just ignore this. How about that? Right? So it wasn't like that. Um, I would say actually lack of awareness probably would accurately describe a significant percentage. Like I think, Jeremy, you give a lot of credit to professors for being far more aware than they probably are of many things, actually. Um, this sounds surprising, but when I was an assistant professor, still new to the job, I was certainly I felt like very aware of many things that were going on. And now
Sure.
that I'm sort of in the mid-career phase, I understand why so many of the older profs back then were a little bit more oblivious than partly
Yeah.
because you can, right? You just
Yeah.
you go in, you do your class, you're
You're
out,
fine.
and you're not exactly sure anything's different from 10 years ago, right? As far as you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless there's something screaming with lights flashing in the classroom, which these issues actually are not in the classroom, right? So by and large,
Interesting. Yeah.
well, not in class, right? Maybe in the
That's fair.
one-on-one meetings, and
Mhm.
only with certain profs, because not every
Yes.
prof is approachable. So imagine you're a not very
100%.
approachable prof, then you're not picking
Very
up
true.
on it because you're actually not seeing the intensity of the signals come through, right? And I think that happens a
Yeah.
lot.
Well,
Uh,
I had a section mate of mine go to one of those not very approachable profs who was also one of those dyed in the wool folks who, had legacy at the school. And that prof solution was like, listen, we can go and get you like unregistered from the program right now. And I was like, boy, howdy, am I gonna like maybe the least helpful response ever because that person is and I'll say that there's maybe situations where that actually is a helpful response, but this was very much a cool, you can't cut it, like we can get you out of here. Like that's not like cool, if
I,
you
I
can't make it,
agree.
we'll,
That's
we'll fire
not,
you. Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, I can't defend that. If you're a prof and you're in the classroom, you have a student that comes to you being vulnerable, this is a really bad thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no way I'd support that. Um, okay, so what was my defense? Ignorance, but I,
No,
I, I
it's
get that
I'm not
that's,
asking you for Brian, you're one of the good ones. Like,
oh,
the fact
thanks.
that we're
No, but
yeah.
I'm just trying to kind of, is to also explain a little bit on the other side
Sure.
that it's not it's an, at least I don't think. I mean, when I was in these meetings, it's not like an evil conspiracy of like, hey guys, let's just mess with these kids, right? Like it really isn't like that. I do think for a significant percentage, it's for a lot of different, they just don't see the signal strongly. And
I'll give you that it wasn't I'll give you that it wasn't a conspiracy. I'll say that I know for a fact the signals. Like, again, Brian's not saying this, I am. If kids are in a place where they're like contemplating doing harm to themselves, and the school is aware of that, and they do nothing, yeah, I bet they didn't come into meetings and say, hey, this is happening, let's ignore it, because that's like, hey, don't think of a pink elephant. Then it's like, okay, well, yeah. But they were actively ignoring it then. I would still say they're actively ignoring it now. And I'm not just, let's try and be, this isn't just an Ivy problem. I would wager and the thing that really, just to put a bow on it, the toxicity of HB1 more than anything is like, it is fueled by, hey, you have to get an internship. Like that summer, you have to have a job, period. And if you don't, you're a loser. Like you're a failure, straight up. Like you have to have a job. So it's all fueled by like the goal of having a job, and then the hierarchy of the jobs of investment banking / consulting at the big three. Then the lower finance jobs, and then marketing is at the bottom. So, and then everyone who doesn't get a job at the top tries to filter to the bottom. So I would say that was what fueled the toxicity. And I would wager it's probably this bad at Rotman. It's probably this bad at Queens. It's probably this bad at Schulich. It's probably this bad at most Ivy League business schools in the States, I would wager. So maybe this is not a Richard Ivey School of Business exclusive problem. And maybe no one's doing anything to fix it, which is also a bad call, because it says at that point a lot about society. But you would actually know better than I would, because you've been to, was it Princeton's business school? Or?
So NYU and Wharton.
Sure. Yeah, Wharton, yeah.
I'll be candid and say I think on the margins there might be marginal differences. I think the overall thing is commonality, right? Between all of them. Yeah. Yeah, I did not necessarily observe that after leaving Ivy. Ivy is a little bit more, they'll use the phrasing of high touch. There's more expectation of a close interaction, the whole section thing. That is unique to Ivy, and it was, as I understand it, it was actually designed essentially to model after Harvard Business Schools. Right. 100%. So the original founding story, as I understand it, that Ivy was founded by ex-HBS folks or profs or whatever, and then basically decided they'd make the Canadian version, but for like 21-year-old kids plus an MBA. Right. So, we can talk about how great an idea that actually was, but it built an institution, and a very successful one by some metrics. Right. So we have to say it really was in some ways. So, I think there are common issues across all that, if you had gone to the others, you'd be like, yeah, I've seen this before, right? I really do think that that's the case, because it's just built in, right, to the system. So I get what you're saying. You're absolutely right about the incentives. There's not a particularly big incentives. It is like a lot of these type of competitive systems, when someone selects out or says they have a problem, the natural inclination, from people on the other side is to do two things. One is to look at the kids who at least publicly say they don't have a problem and seem like they're doing fine, right? And then to do the comparison. And then the other is to say, well, if we're a very competitive system, then I guess this is what people who can't compete would say, right? Like that sort of, so then it's very hard then to create a reflective environment. And there certainly were individuals I knew back then that I think, hopefully are still there and would have the values where I think they would care. But remember that it's an institution, right? And so no one person is the whole thing. So at best, they're like a slice of the machine. And if the machine is actually by design not really functioning, or has the weaknesses, shall we say, that you've described, it's hard for even someone who does care and is aware, but only has a slice to actually change. I mean, you thought you couldn't do much. And you're also presuming that some of us could, right? And
Sure,
maybe
sure.
that actually would, I would say that that probably would be tough. Partly because there's, again, very strong incentives to just kind of say, well, the system seems to be working just fine based on the metrics that we care about, right?
So what I would say is, I went to the dean of the HBA program. So I would imagine that, um, now even her hands are somewhat tied in the sense that, if Ivy went down some sort of hippie-ish path, which is how the board of directors might observe it, because it all goes back to, it's all just hazing. Like that's all it is. It's like, why do organizations hate, why do frats, sororities, whatever, haze? And it's like, well, I had to go through it, and now you have to go. And so it's like, well, if these kids don't have to go through it, how are they going to be tough enough for the actual world out there, which is way tougher? My experience is that it's not really. And like it's not, and hey, maybe that's the organization's Ivy. Because like maybe some of those investment bankers who crushed at Ivy are like, no, are you joking? Like it's still, I think it's funny, but it actually reflects like deep toxicity. The investment banker saying of like, hey, you don't bother coming in on if you don't come in on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Sunday. Like you're gone. And it's like, how could this going to school, how could that be harder than that? I'm like, hey, fair enough, man. So I'll just speak for myself. But yeah, I recognize it's I never asked this change of a prof. I did ask it of the dean of the program. And whether it's for liability or political or whatever reasons, their hands were tied. And funny enough that you bring up this whole people who are privately not okay versus people who publicly are. The person that I mentioned, who it was suggested to drop out of the program, I would say that 10 years on, she's actually the runaway most successful person in our section. I'd probably say the wealthiest person in our section. And I would say that it's not especially close, which is really interesting. Um, yeah, so those are the bets that I would place on that. So it's very funny to me that, I was probably calling asking for donations. And I would say it's very funny to me that this person who was not told, but told, hey, maybe you should drop out, has gone on to be, I think, the most successful of my section, maybe of that class. I don't know the classes. I haven't tracked that as well. And maybe that's an indication of, hey, maybe your metrics are completely wrong.